Most immigrants coming to North America arrive with high hopes. They expect to work hard, and they assume their efforts will somehow yield tangible rewards for themselves or their children. Over the centuries, the dream has not always been fulfilled, but the dream exists. It did not exist, however, for Africans arriving in colonial North America after the terrible transformation. They had no choice in their deportation and no knowledge of their destination. From the hold of a slave ship, they could only speculate about the reason for their abduction and the nature of their impending fate. What awaited them was a world of work, sometimes unending labor, rigidly controlled. Equiano and thousands of other people like him soon came to the realization that they were to be kept alive, but only in order to work. Their labor would benefit others rather than themselves. They would be granted minimal food and clothing and shelter in exchange for their toil. There would be no wages and no possibility to save for a better future. Indeed, it seemed clear there would be no better future. The incentive for parents to work hard so that their children could enjoy a better life had been removed for almost all Africans by the terrible transformation to race slavery, which obliged each generation to inherit the same unfree status of the last. The servitude facing African newcomers was the horrible outgrowth of unprecedented economic warfare of an international scale. With the rise of European exploration overseas, the battles for supremacy among a few rival monarchies had spread far beyond Europe. Their struggles to establish profitable colonies abroad took on new intensity after the religious Reformation divided Europe into competing Protestant and Catholic powers. By creating diverse colonial settlements, each country hoped to provide itself with a steady flow of resources: gold and silver, furs and fish, timber and tobacco, sugar and rice. At the same time, they would prevent rivals from obtaining access to the same goods unless they were willing to pay a high price. By 1700, mounting competition had led to the creation of numerous New World colonies, and during the 18th century, rival European powers would establish additional outposts in all corners of North America. In successive generations, the French colonized Louisiana, the English settled Georgia, the Spanish entered California, and the Russians laid claim to Alaska. Though very different in location and purpose, each new European settlement demanded a steady supply of labor in order to survive and grow as a profitable colony. In many places accessible to the transatlantic slave trade, it was Africans who filled that growing demand for labor during the century before the American Revolution. Work, therefore, dominated the lives of all enslaved African Americans, men and women, young and old, but the nature of the work varied significantly from one place to the next, from one season to the next, from one generation to the next. Cotton agriculture, though present in Africa, did not yet exist in North America. Later generations of African Americans would be obliged to pick cotton all across the Deep South after 1800, but their ancestors in colonial times faced a different array of tasks. Most lived in the Chesapeake region and the coastal Southeast, where the lengthy growing season promised enormous profits to aggressive white investors once the land had been cleared for plantation agriculture. African newcomers, women as well as men, soon found themselves cutting and burning trees, splitting rails, and building fences. Using an axe and a hatchet, each individual was expected to clear several acres of southern wilderness in a single season. For some, the work with wood never ended. Buildings were needed, and workers spent long hours felling trees and then squaring the logs with an adze. The huge timbers were placed over saw pits and cut into planks by two men using a two-handled saw. The person who stood above the beam, known as the top dog, avoided the shower of sawdust. We still use this phrase for someone in a privileged position. Guided by an African parent or a white overseer, a skilled black youth might learn to be a wheelwright, a house carpenter, a shingle cutter, a boat builder, or a cabinet maker. But who is most likely to make barrels? for these huge containers were crucial for the safe shipment of valuable products over long distances. Barrels pieced together from several staves of wood were needed for fish and rum in New England, for grain and tobacco in Chesapeake, for rice and indigo in South Carolina. By the 18th century, timber, which had been cleared to make room for plantations, was scarce on Caribbean islands, so staves shaped from American trees were sold to the West Indies, where they were assembled into barrels for shipping Caribbean sugar and molasses. The transportation needs of the expanding colonies demanded various sorts of labor. Africans found themselves pressing into service, building wagons, hammering horseshoes, stitching saddles, and mending harnesses. Amos Fortune, an African, who ended his days as a free leather worker in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, worked for a tanner in Woburn, Massachusetts for 2 decades before gaining his freedom. Black South Carolinians built dugout canoes from cypress logs and fashioned larger boats to float the rice crop from Charleston via the winding rivers. After crops were harvested every fall, planters in South Carolina's coastal low country were required to send enslaved workers to dig ditches. Over several generations, they created an amazing network of canals, a web of waterways linking local rivers for travel and irrigation. Near Chesapeake Bay, slaves constructed roads along which huge round wooden hogsheads of tobacco could be rolled to ships waiting at harbor and riverside piers. In Maryland, one of these thoroughfares is still known as Rolling Road after more than 200 years. Sooner or later, all colonial roads led down to the sea and ships. England's North American colonists clustered around rivers and ports. They sold their surplus produce to Europe and received a steady supply of manufactured goods in return, everything from hats and hatchets to china and window glass. They also sent to the West Indies quantities of salted fish to be used as food for enslaved workers and supplies of firewood to be used in boiling sugarcane into molasses. In return, they brought back slaves who had not yet been sold in Caribbean markets, along with barrels of molasses to be made into rum and shipped to Africa as a commodity in the slave trade. In North Carolina, slaves cut pine trees filled with resin and then burned the wood in closed ovens to produce tar and pitch for use by English sailors. French seamen needed similar materials for protecting the hulls and riggings of their ships. In 1724, an English report suggested that rival French colonists in Louisiana were producing pitch and tar and had already settled 4 plantations with 50 Negroes on each to carry out that work. Besides working in the dangerous production of tar and pitch, African American artisans were involved in all aspects of the colonial boat building trade. Frederick Douglass, at age 11, was sent to work in his master's shipyard near Baltimore in 1829. The young slave's experience, vividly described in his autobiography, must have been shared by generations of African Americans before him. It was, "Fred, come help me cant this timber here. Hurry, Fred. Run and bring me a chisel. I say, Fred, bear a hand, and get up a fire as quick as lightning under the stream box. Hello?" And, word, "Come turn this grindstone. Come, move, and chisel this timber forward. I say," expletive, "blast your eyes. Why don't you heat up some pitch? Hello. 3 voices at the same time. "Come here, go there. Hold on where you are. Damn you, if you move, I'll knock your brains out. This was my school." It was one thing to build ships, quite another to sail on them. Douglass himself recalled how, as a boy growing up near Chesapeake Bay, he used to watch sails from every quarter of the habitable globe and wish that he was on board. Numerous colonial slaves, just as ingenious but less well known than Douglass, found ways to leave shore and become harbor pilots and deep-sea sailors. Equiano, for example, was purchased by the captain of a British merchant ship shortly before his arrival in Virginia, and he spent decades sailing the Atlantic, working for different owners on various ships before finally securing his freedom. Equiano had never seen the ocean, or even a large river, before being taken from his small village as a boy, but many Africans arrived in America with a knowledge of the sea. Those from coastal regions were experienced swimmers, not afraid of bathing and diving as most 18th century Europeans. Others were expert fishermen, and they put their skills to good use in fish-filled bays and rivers of the American coast. Black newcomers in South Carolina and Georgia found an abundance of shrimp, a delicacy well known to many African Americans, but foreign to Europeans, in the water surrounding the coastal sea islands. They moved casting nets and hauled in schools of tasty shrimp, just as they had done in West Africa. In southern swamps and rivers, the Europeans proved frightened by the strange alligators. Africans, on the other hand, were familiar with killing and eating crocodiles, so many of them knew how to confront such dangerous reptiles without fear. Black women often worked in the fields, as many of them had done in Africa, but they also assumed primary responsibility for a great deal of domestic labor. House servants were forced to cook and clean, wash and press, sew and mend, to suit the demands of their colonial mistress, with varying degrees of oversight. A plantation cook handled all aspects of food preparation, from tending the garden or visiting the town market to washing the dishes and throwing leftovers to the pigs. Indeed, when it came time to slaughter the hogs and cure their meat, she supervised that complex process as well. Day after day, year after year, she was obliged to balance the endless demands of the white household and the ongoing needs of her own family. Nothing illustrates this conflict more dramatically than the fact that a mother of a black infant was sometimes required to stop suckling her own baby and to serve instead as a wet nurse to a newborn child in the family of her master. Southern planters noted approvingly that African women were generally experienced agriculturalists, while women coming from Europe usually were not. They also realized that Africans were less troubled by the seasonal bouts of malaria, and often sickened European workers, though no one yet understood that a distinct blood trait, now known as sickle cell, contributed to this difference. In addition, they observed an obvious benefit in the fact that West Africans were generally familiar with survival in a warm and humid climate. They knew how to take advantage of shade trees and summer breezes in locating their dwellings, and they were familiar with many of the plants and animals that existed in the subtropics. Where the flora and fauna differed from the Old World, enslaved Africans could turn to local Indians for knowledge. Indian slaves still made up a portion of the colonial workforce in the early 18th century. Moreover, Africans were involved in the early Indian wars on the frontier and participated in the extensive fur trade. It was risky business. The black man who accompanied white trader John Lawson among the Tuscaroras in 1711 was burned at the stake alongside Lawson when hostilities broke out between the Indians and the English. But others survived these encounters and acquired important information, even learning to speak the Indian languages. In 1717, Timbo was one of several enslaved Africans accompanying a large pack train into the southern backcountry. According to the commissioners on the Indian trade, he was to tend the pack horses. They were more than 20, and to serve as interpreter. These frontier activities brought black men into frequent contact with Native Americans, and eventually this aroused the fear of white authorities. They worried about any black person who was carrying a gun, exploring the countryside, and gaining the acquaintance of Indians willing to harbor runaways. Therefore, they passed laws limiting the participation of enslaved Africans in frontier warfare and Indian trade. They even went so far as to offer handsome rewards to Indians who brought back runaway slaves, dead or alive. By the 1720s, of course, African Americans had already been in contact with Indians for more than 200 years, and this complex and important relationship would continue throughout North America regardless of such laws. Consider the example of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, who was born in Canada or the Caribbean to a French and an African parent. Little is known about his early life, but in the 1770s, this Afro-French fur trader was living on a 30-acre tract beside Lake Michigan with a Potawatomi Indian woman named Catherine. During the years of the American Revolution, he managed to pay off competing British and American interests, emerging after the war as a successful trading post operator. Jean and Catherine raised a son and a daughter, adding 400 acres to their tract and building a log home surrounded by a mill, bakehouse, workshop, a smokehouse, and barns for the livestock. Their frontier marriage was formally acknowledged with a Catholic wedding service in 1778, but when Catherine died in 1800, Jean sold their extensive property in order to move further west to live with his son in Missouri. The estate proved to be worth $1,200, not including 30 head of cattle, 2 mules, 38 pigs, and a yard full of chickens. Although DuSable died poorly in 1818, the strategic site he had developed would grow to be the vast and booming city of Chicago. The extent of Indian-African contact in the 18th century is evident in the way the Southern diet evolved in colonial times. Such African food as okra, yams, peanuts, and sesame seeds made their way into Southern cooking. Often, they were combined with traditional Indian delicacies, as in gumbo, the famous specialty of Louisiana cuisine. The thick base is made by cooking sliced okra, an African dish, or powdered sassafras, a Choctaw Indian staple, in slowly heated oil. Even the word gumbo may come from the Angolan guingumbo for okra, or the Choctaw kombo ashish for sassafras powder. Food containers and utensils also revealed traditions from Africa, reinforced by New World Indian practices. The palmetto tree of coastal Carolina, which appeared strange and exotic to Europeans, was familiar to African newcomers as well as Indian residents. Soon, black Carolinians were using strips from the long palmetto leaves to bind together circular baskets of all shapes and sizes, much as they had in Africa. Gourds, like palmetto trees, were familiar to Africans and Indians, as the experience of Esteban in an earlier century made clear. Southern Indians had long used light, durable gourds for bowls, dippers, and storage containers, as had arriving Africans. In contrast, English colonists coming from a cool climate had little familiarity with gourds and their practical possibilities. In addition, we now know that African American artisans were fashioning their own clay pots and bowls, which were different from European earthenware, but similar to much Native American pottery. These simple vessels, now known as colonialware, have been correctly identified only in recent years. In short, the Africans who survived the Middle Passage brought numerous skills with them and acquired others from Indian neighbors who already knew which local plants were edible and which had special medicinal value. Ironically, the slaves' ability to persevere and subsist under harsh conditions only benefited their self-styled owners. Obviously, workers who raised their own food in small garden plots and caught fish in the local stream saved a planter the expense of supplying provisions. A strong man who had hammered iron in Africa needed little instruction in metalworking and a colonial forge. Occasionally, Europeans seized and exploited more than the African labor. They took advantage of superior African knowledge as well. The story of profitable rice cultivation in colonial South Carolina is a good example. After the founding of Carolina in 1670, English colonists spent a full generation seeking a suitable staple crop. In order to have enough food, a few of the earliest enslaved Africans in the settlement began growing rice in the wet swampland, as they had done in their homeland. English planters, who were largely unfamiliar with rice, realized the conditions were excellent for this crop and began to learn more. Production grew rapidly as Africans showed them how to irrigate the plants in the field, pound the rice kernels with a wooden mortar and pestle, and winnow the chaff with a fanner basket. Soon, slave merchants were advertising workers from the so-called rice coast of West Africa, and profits from the sale of Carolina rice were making local plantation owners the richest gentry in North America. French Louisiana began importing Africans aggressively around 1718, the year New Orleans was founded. French officials promptly urged captains to import several Africans who know how to cultivate rice. along the hogsheads of rice suitable for planting. By 1775, roughly 500,000 African Americans were living and laboring in North America. Throughout the colonies, a small proportion were free blacks, but most were legally enslaved, and most lived in the South. As their numbers increased, so did the profits from their work. Wealthy planters acquired more land and bought additional slaves, so an increasing number of enslaved black colonists found themselves working on large plantations. This was especially true in the Chesapeake region, where nearly half of the entire African American population labored in the tobacco fields of Virginia and Maryland. Thomas Jefferson, still in his 30s, owned nearly 400 black Virginians on the eve of the Revolution, and George Washington, enslaved labor force, was even larger. Washington, Jefferson, and other members of the Virginia gentry were dismayed to see so much of the wealth generated by their African workers passing into the hands of London merchants instead of into their own pockets. The grievances of white colonists would eventually prompt their demands for freedom from English rule. But 18th century African Americans gained few rewards from the revolutionary struggle. Nevertheless, black Americans had been engaged in a successful revolutionary battle of their own over several generations. Throughout the 18th century, they have been struggling against tremendous odds to build the cultural framework that would allow their survival in a harsh and alien land. At times, this struggle for survival led individuals and groups to engage in acts of open defiance and revolt. Many lives were lost, but crucial victories were won in gradually laying the foundation for African American culture. When Thomas Jefferson and George Washington proclaimed the nation's independence, 500,000 African Americans remained without their liberty.